welcome everyone who's tuning in. And tonight we're going to be discussing the Torah portion, which for this week, but besides the Torah portion itself, this Shabbos has a title which is unique because it's a title that no other Shabbos has. The title is Shabbos Haggadol or Shabbat Haggadol, the Great Shabbos. Why is it called the Great Shabbos? So there are literally dozens, if not hundreds, of reasons that have been given over the ages. Because it's a little bit enigmatic. What was so special about this Shabbos that it's called the Great Shabbos? There are a lot of other special Shabbos, Sabbaths, that some of them have titles, like we had the Shabbos of Shkolim, of the giving of the shekel. They had the Shabbos of remembrance, remembering Amalek, and so on. You have a Shabbos before Yom Kippur called Shabbos Shuvah, the Shabbos of repentance, of return. And during the book of Exodus, there's a Shabbos that we read called Shabbos Shira, the Shabbos of song. We read the song the people sang when they crossed the sea. So we have a lot of unique, very colorful Shabbos, Sabbaths, but none of them are called the Great Sabbath, just this one. So what's so special about this one? It's the Shabbos before Pesach. There's no special Torah reading. All the others that are special have a special Torah reading, a special Haftorah reading. This Shabbos does not have a special Torah reading. It does have a special Haftorah reading, but it's not read every year in many communities. It's only read in certain years, which we won't go into right now. So why is it called Shabbos Haggadol? So the primary reason given is that when the Jews were preparing themselves for the Exodus, they were told that the Egyptians are going to be stricken with a plague that will be worse than all the other plagues, the plague of the firstborn, that every firstborn Egyptian will perish at midnight. And this was not kept a secret. The Egyptians were told about this, were warned ahead of time. And firstborn Egyptians, who were the elite, were terrified that we're going to be victims. They knew that all the promises that Moses made about the other 9 plagues came to fruition. They suffered horribly, and this plague they knew was going to happen as well. So they started to agitate with the authorities. Let them go. Let those Jews go already. Why should we suffer any more than we've suffered until now? But the authorities, God hardened their heart. He hardened Pharaoh's heart. And they said, no, we're not going to let them go. And a civil war broke out. And they were fighting each other. And the book of Psalms, the book of Tehillim, and some of which we recite at the night of the Seder, there are 26 different things that we thank God for what he has done. And one of those things is Lamake Mitzrayim Bivchorehem, who struck the Egyptians with their firstborn, which means that the firstborns themselves were fighting a civil war to let the Jews go. That was the great miracle that happened. That's why it's called Shabbos Haggadol, the Great Shabbos, because it's the great miracle. The only problem with this is that it happened on the 10th day of Nisan. Why did it happen on the 10th day of Nisan? Well, what's the significance of the 10th day? How did the people know that there's going to be a 10th plague? How did the Egyptians know? Because the Jews were commanded 4 days before Passover to take a lamb and bring it into their homes and tie it to their beds to make sure that nothing happens to it, it doesn't become blemished. And all of a sudden, hundreds of thousands of Jews are taking lambs and bringing it into their homes. Obviously, this piqued the curiosity of the Egyptians. What are you doing over here? What's going on? And they said, oh, haven't you heard? In another 4 days, there's going to be the plague of the firstborn, that you are all going to lose your firstborn, and if you're firstborn, you're going to die, and we're going to be going out of Egypt. So the firstborn, when they heard this, they started this civil war. But when did that happen? It happened on the 4 days before, on the 10th day of Nisan. So why do we observe this great miracle on Shabbos? Shabbos is not always the 10th. This year, Shabbos will be, today is Today is Monday, and today is the 7th, so it's the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, the 12th day of the month of Nisan, not the 10th. So the classic reason given why we don't observe this on the 10th of the month, as we do every other holiday. Passover happened on a Thursday, according to our sages, but we don't observe Passover Thursday necessarily. We observe it on the 14th, 15th day of the month of Nisan. Same with Sukkot, same with Shavuos. Jewish holidays go by the day of the month, not by the day of the week. Yet this observance of this great miracle we observe on the 10th, not on the 10th necessarily, but on a Shabbos, which then was the 10th of Nisan. Why do we defer to Shabbos instead of going by the day of the month? So the official answer is that years later, decades later, Miriam, the greatest Jewish woman that ever lived, arguably, one of the greatest leaders that the Jews ever had, passed away on the 10th of Nisan. So it's not a day that they wanted to designate as a holiday, as a joyous holiday, because it marks the passing of Miriam. And therefore, instead of doing it on the 10th, they do it on the Shabbos, which is the day of the week in which this miracle happened. But that still needs more clarification. It must mean that there's something that Shabbos has in common with this miracle. So the Rabbi explains that what was so special about this miracle? This miracle, if you think about it, didn't really affect the status of the Jewish people. It didn't save anyone's life. The Jews were not going to go out of Egypt a day earlier because of this. They left Egypt the time that God designated for the first plague, or the 10th plague of the firstborn, and it wasn't accelerated by even a minute. No Jew who was in danger of his life was spared because of this miracle. There was no danger to their lives. So why do we extol this miracle as being such a great miracle? There are great miracles. Splitting of the sea is a great miracle. When anyone would see it, it would be marveling at the immensity of this miracle. But just because there were Egyptians fighting with each other, why is that considered a miracle? So the Rebbe explains that that's the ultimate miracle. The ultimate miracle is for evil to be transformed. And that will happen in the Messianic age. When Moshiach comes, evil will eventually disappear, and not just disappear, but its energy will be transformed into goodness, into holiness. That's the ultimate miracle that we want. And that's what happened then. It wasn't just a miracle to save people's lives. That's great, that's wonderful, it's supernatural, it's even more fantastic. But that's not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is not to perform miracles, for God to show he can do things that defy the laws of nature. The ultimate miracle is when you can take evil and weaken it. Moreover, when you can take evil and get evil to be on your side. So who cares if it saves someone's life or it produced some type of positive results? That is the positive result, that you're able to get the evil Egyptians, the elite of the Egyptians who were fighting, albeit for their own interests, but they're still fighting for the Jewish people. And that's the ultimate miracle, and that's what Shabbos is all about. Shabbos is not just a day of rest. Shabbos is a day when the evil, when the negative forces of the world are transformed into positive forces. And that's why the miracle was connected to Shabbos, not to the 10th day of Nisan, but it's by being observed on Shabbos, it highlights the idea that Shabbos takes away from all negative influences, as it says in the Zohar at great length, and many people recite it Friday night, how all the evil just dissipates, disappears, and to some extent even transformed. That's the greatness of the Shabbos, and that's the miracle of the firstborn. There are many other reasons given why we call it Shabbos Haggadol. I'll just share another reason or two. There was a very big debate between the rabbis and the Sadducees. The Sadducees were a group of people who, in the early period of the Second Temple, broke away from Judaism, that believed in and followed an oral tradition. When you read the Torah, the written Torah, it's filled with ambiguous statements. It's filled with apparent contradictions. And the only way you could understand what the Torah is all about and fill in all the gaps and all the details. For example, the Torah says you're supposed to rest on the Shabbos. It doesn't tell you how you're supposed to rest, what that means. And of course, we have the oral tradition gives us all the criteria for what is forbidden on Shabbos. Without the oral tradition, virtually no part of the Torah would have been intelligible to us and accessible to us and practical. Same thing with so many other areas of the Torah. The classic example given by Maimonides and others is the eye for an eye, and we've been accused of being people into vengeance, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And yet the Talmud, which records this oral tradition, it was oral until it was finally put into writing, that it never meant literally taking an eye for an eye. It meant the idea of compensation for the value of the eye. Without going into much more detail, how do we know that? Because this was passed down orally. The same thing with how do we observe all the holidays? How do we know what matzah is? How do we know what a lulav is and a shofar is? The Torah never says that on Rosh Hashanah we're supposed to blow a shofar. What the Torah does say is the first day of the 7th month is a day of blowing. It doesn't say what you're supposed to blow. It doesn't even call it Rosh Hashanah. That the holiday that everyone observes, all Jews observe at the beginning of the year, that they call Rosh Hashanah, is never referred to in the Torah as Rosh Hashanah. That's all in the oral tradition. So the Sadducees were a group of people started by a man called Tzadok, that's where the name Sadducee comes from, who broke away from traditional Judaism and claimed that he is following strictly the literal meaning of the biblical text without the oral tradition. And in order to demonstrate how we reject that heresy, there are a lot of things that the rabbis instituted that focused strongly on those traditions. So what happened over here? Here was a big dispute. In the Torah it says that the day after, when it talks about Pesach, Passover, the day after Shabbos, you're supposed to count 50 days. And the 50th day is the holiday of Shavuos. That's the anniversary of the giving of the Torah. Well, when do you start counting? It says the day after Shabbos. And it's in the context of Pesach. So the Sadducees say that means literally you start counting on a Sunday. And you always end, the 7 weeks always ends on a Shabbos. And the next day is Shavuos. Every year it's the same thing. The rabbis knew, based on the oral tradition that was passed down from God to Moses and from him to the next generations, that it didn't mean Shabbos, what we call Shabbos, Sabbath, the 7th day of the week. It means the day after Pesach, the 2nd day of the holiday of Passover, because the holidays are also called Shabbos, simply because Shabbos comes from a root that means to rest, and on holidays you're also supposed to rest. You're not allowed to do certain kinds of work on the holidays, just like on Shabbos. So this was a major debate that went on for several generations. Do we start counting on a Sunday, the day after Shabbos that coincides with Passover or around Passover, or do we go by the 2nd day of the holiday? In order to underscore that the word Shabbos in the Torah means holiday, they contrasted it with the Shabbos beforehand. And the Shabbos beforehand was called Shabbat Haggadol, the Great Shabbos, as if to say that the day of the holiday is the smaller Shabbos, because Shabbos is considered holier than any of the holidays. Shabbos is the holiest of the holidays, more so than any other holiday. So when you call the Shabbos before the Great Shabbos, it's to contrast it with the Shabbos, namely the first day of the holiday. So we know when the Torah says the day after Shabbos, it's referring to the small Shabbos. The Shabbos before is the big Shabbos. There's another answer given why we call this the Great Shabbos. And it sounds a little bit less serious than the other answers, because it's customary for the rabbis to give long speeches on this Shabbos. And initially, the reason for this long speech was to prepare people for the holiday, to teach them how to eat matzah on Passover, how much matzah you have to eat, how you eat it, and so on. How do you drink the 4 cups of wine? How you get rid of your chametz, the leavened products, and so on. But then it turned into a time for the rabbi to give long drashos, long speeches, long sermons. And therefore the Shabbos was a long Shabbos because everyone was listening to the rabbi droning on for hours. It doesn't sound like a serious explanation, but this explanation is attributed to Rashi, who's one of the greatest of the sages of all times. So it must have some serious part to it. So I think the serious part to it is that the Shabbos before Pesach, we focus on Torah. We focus on the study of Torah, because we have to realize that the whole idea of the Exodus was not just to free the Jewish people, but was to get them to prepare them for the receiving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. So before we even start the Shabbos, we already established that Shabbos is a time to study Torah. And before we get into the Exodus, we already have to know what the goal is. And that's why the rabbis would speak a lot, because the point was to highlight the importance of Torah study. That's why it was called the Great Shabbos, because Torah is called great. Torah itself is referred to as being great. These are some of the explanations, and there are many, many dozens, if not hundreds, more explanations. But this is a very special Shabbos. The Parsha of the week is Parshas Mitzorah. Some years, most years, when it's not a leap year, Mitzorah goes together with last week's Parsha, which is Tazria. And they both talk about the same subject, and the subject is Tzara'at, the skin disease that is often confused with leprosy, but it's a skin lesions that were not just physical ailments, but they were manifestations of a spiritual ailment. The spiritual ailment was the person has degraded himself or herself by speaking ill of others, lashon hara, the evil tongue or slander, which is considered to be a very serious sin in Judaism. And in the days of yore, when a person would be guilty of lashon hara, they would break out with these lesions that would force them to be separated, secluded for a week or two, so that the person would get a taste of his own medicine. Just like by speaking ill of others, you cause that person to be victimized and isolated. No one wants to talk to that person because you said such horrible things about them. So you created division and you created separation. Well, you get a taste of your own medicine and you become separated, and you learn what you've done wrong by experiencing the same effects that you caused the others to suffer from. So that's the basic idea of Tzara'at, but you don't see it around these days. People talk a lot of lashon hara, but you don't see these people going around going to dermatologists. I don't know if they ever did a study, but if they ever asked dermatologists, how many patients of yours are guilty of lashon hara and how many are not, and to see that the preponderance is in favor of those who do speak lashon hara. It's not common. It's a very uncommon thing, and it doesn't happen that often. So the Hasidic masters explain that Tzara'at only happened to people who were spiritually sophisticated. It didn't happen to every Tom, Dick, and Harry. It didn't happen to every person, because the idea of Tzara'at was that your evil was on the surface. You were essentially a very pure, holy, wholesome person. But because you said something that was not proper, that evil couldn't be absorbed. It was spit out. It was like a reaction, an allergic reaction. an allergic reaction. When a person is allergic to something, he breaks out in hives and rashes. It can't be internalized. The body can't handle it. That's the reason why the Metzora was essentially a very, very spiritual person. Who do we find in the Torah that became a Metzora? We find Moses. When Moses says to God, when God tells him to take the Jews out of Egypt, and he says, are they worthy of being taken out? He spoke ill of them. So God struck Moses that his hand became white and full of this skin disorder. And likewise, we find Miriam, equally holy person. She spoke very mildly critical of her brother Moses, for reasons we won't go into right now, and she became a Metzora for a week. So we see that it happens to very, very holy people, for very great people. And in the mystical teachings of Judaism, we're told that Tzara'at is a very high spiritual energy, but that spiritual energy cannot be contained, so it has a negative effect. And that's why the Talmud refers to Moshiach as a Metzora. If you want to find Moshiach, the Talmud tells a story of how one of the sages, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, would speak to Elijah the prophet, and he asked him, when is Moshiach coming? And Elijah answered, why don't you ask Moshiach himself? Well, where is he? He's at the entrance of Rome, and he's sitting among all the lepers. We'll use the word lepers advisedly. It's not necessarily leprosy, but it's the skin disorder. And he's sitting among all these lepers. So how will I know which one is Moshiach? He says, well, he does things differently. They all have to bandage themselves, and they have lesions all over. So you look at all of the people there who are putting on bandages on their lesions. First, they remove all the bandages from all the places on their body where they have these lesions, and then they put on fresh bandages. It takes a lot of time. Moshiach, because he wants to be ready to come to redeem the people on moment's notice, doesn't want to spend time on removing bandages, rebandaging, so he just takes off one bandage and puts another bandage on. Then he goes to the next one, just in case he gets the signal that it's time for him to liberate the people. He doesn't have to delay even a second, because there's nothing more that Mashiach wants than to take the people out of exile. That's how you know who Mashiach is. So we see from this passage in the Talmud that Mashiach is associated with Tzara'at, and the Talmud actually says that's one of the titles that's given to Mashiach, that he is a master of Tzara'at, because Mashiach himself represents the state of the Jewish people at the time of the redemption, that after going through thousands of years of painful suffering, of cleansing, of catharsis, of every time Jews go through persecution, it purifies them, it sanctifies them, so that whatever evil is left amongst them, it's only residual evil. It's only on the surface. It's on the outside. It's not within. It's not inside. And which explains, the Rebbe used this to explain, how could we say that we are a perfect people? We know all of our imperfections. So the Rebbe says, when we look at the Jewish people, we're not looking at one group that's living at a certain time in a certain place. We're looking about all Jews that have ever lived. They make up one body. There is the head generation, there is the heart generation, the arm generation, the leg generation, and the entire Jewish people represent one entity, one organic whole. And as we are a people who went through thousands of years of cleansing through our suffering in exile, and likewise through all the positive things that we've done, we are essentially an ideal, holy nation. Does it mean we're perfect? No, we're far from perfect, but it's like the Rebbe used the analogy, I believe, going to a doctor for your checkup, and the doctor checks your vitals, your head is working, your heart is working, your lungs are working, your kidneys are working, your liver is working, all your vital organs are healthy. You have some pains and aches. Okay, take a little medication, take some Tylenol, deal with the aches and pains. We are like a body that went through the historic checkup, and God says we are a healthy people with imperfections that we have to deal with. And the faster we deal with them, the faster the redemption will come. But we're essentially a worthy people. And that's the model of the Metzorah. The Metzorah is the person who's essentially a pure soul, a holy soul with some imperfection on the surface, external, that's not really what defines the person. And that's the model of and the metaphor of the Metzorah. Just one other point. When the person had Tzara'at, how would he know what it is? Did he know that it was really something that renders him ritually unclean? So you have to know the laws. There's a whole tractate of the Mishnah that deals with these laws. Many of the laws are actually mentioned explicitly in the Torah. But as much as you would know the laws to identify, you could be a dermatologist and you could identify it exactly. The person wouldn't be tameh, wouldn't be ritually unclean unless a Kohen declared the person to be ritually unclean. The Kohen might be an ignoramus and not know the laws, so someone else has to inform him, but he has to declare the person tameh, unclean. Why is that? So the Rebbe explains, the Kohen is called Ish HaChesed. He's a man of kindness. Who has the right, who has the authority, who has the license to tell a person, you are unclean, you are deficient, you need to shape up, you have to do something to purify yourself? It has to come from a person who's motivated exclusively by chesed, by kindness. As you have the expression tough love. Who could be tough to another human being? Only if it's motivated by love, that you care so much for that person, you're willing to do something uncomfortable of telling that person where they're missing the mark and where they're transgressing, and you ask them and you help them to be rehabilitated. In order to put someone in their place, you have to do it out of love. And that's why the Torah tells us the Kohen, who personifies chesed, kindness, is the one to do it. No one else can do it. Even if they know the laws, they need the Kohen to do it. On that note, I'd like to wish everyone a Chag kosher v'sameach, a kosher and happy Passover. What do we mean when we wish people kosher? Some people could be offended by that. Oh, you think that I'm not really kosher and you're wishing me that I should be kosher? No. We wish it to great rabbis, because Passover, the laws are so strict about not having the slightest amount of chametz in our possession, certainly not to eat it or derive benefit from it. And it's almost impossible to be perfect in this regard. So you need special protection, that everything should go smoothly, that you should be able to get rid of your chametz without any mishap. And that's why we wish one another, may God protect you, that you should be able to observe Passover in the most ideal way, that nothing negative should happen, should be kosher, and then it'll be sameach, it'll be a joyous holiday. It will not be marred by any type of imperfection, of any type of chametz. And on that note, everyone should have a kosher and happy Pesach, and may this be the festival of liberation, not just of what happened in the past, but we should see the miracles we saw this week. We saw miracles with Iran. Let's hope that we don't need these miracles anymore, because that will be the end of their evil. And this Shabbat Haggadol will be the real Shabbat, Great Shabbat, when the enemies will be transformed into friends with God's help.